Inside California's Corcoran Prison, the deadly secrets of one of America's most violent prisons. Behind the tall fences and armed guard towers of Corcoran State Prison lies a story of violence, power, and systemic failure. Built to be one of California's most secure correctional facilities, Corcoran became infamous for something darker: brutality among inmates, corruption among officers, and scandals that would shock the nation. What really happened inside those concrete walls? And how did a prison meant to control chaos become a symbol of it? Before we dive into today's powerful story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more gripping tales. Your support helps us keep sharing these stories, and we wouldn't want you to miss any of the action. Now, let's get started. The Birth of a Monster, 1988 to 1990. Corcoran State Prison, officially known as California State Prison, Corcoran, CSP Corcoran, opened its gates in 1988 in the San Joaquin Valley, Kings County. At the time, California's prison system was struggling with overcrowding and escalating violence following the state's tough-on-crime policies of the 1980s. Designed as a high-security facility, Corcoran was built to house roughly 5,000 inmates, including some of the most dangerous criminals in the state. The prison was divided into multiple facilities, labeled A through F, each serving different purposes. Facility 4B, for example, would later become notorious for housing high-risk inmates, including gang leaders and violent offenders transferred from other institutions. Many of these men had histories of assaults, riots, or escape attempts, and were considered unmanageable elsewhere. The layout was modern by 1980s standards: control booths overlooking cell pods, electronic doors, and gun rails above the yards. Yet from its earliest years, Corcoran faced issues that hinted at a much deeper problem: a culture of violence that seemed to thrive behind its walls. Inmates from rival gangs, the Aryan Brotherhood, Mexican Mafia, Black Guerrilla Family, and Nostra Familia, were often placed in proximity to each other in exercise yards, barely the size of a tennis court. Officially, these sessions were meant to provide fresh air and exercise under strict supervision. In practice, they became arenas for bloodshed. The first signs of trouble. By 1989, within a year of opening, reports of severe inmate beatings, excessive force, and questionable yard incidents began surfacing. According to internal memos later uncovered, staff had developed a reputation for staging gladiator fights, setting rival gang members against each other while armed guards observed from above. Although administrators denied knowledge of such practices at the time, rumors spread among prisoners and families. Lawsuits began to trickle in from inmates claiming deliberate exposure to danger. California's Department of Corrections, CDC, later CDCR, initially dismissed these claims as fabricated, until investigative journalists and federal prosecutors began to take interest in the early 1990s. Life inside the walls. Inmates described Corcoran as a place ruled by tension and unpredictability. A former prisoner interviewed years later described the atmosphere. You never knew if you were going to make it out of the yard alive. Cells were small, 6 by 9 feet, with steel bunks, narrow windows, and limited ventilation. Overcrowding quickly became an issue, leading to double celling even in units designed for one inmate. Conditions were harsh, with strict lockdowns and frequent use of force. Prisoners spent most of their time in isolation or under armed watch. For guards, the environment was equally stressful, a constant state of alert, surrounded by men with nothing to lose. But while tension between inmates and officers is normal in maximum security facilities, what made Corcoran stand out was the frequency and fatality of violent incidents. Between 1988 and 1995, official records show that guards shot and killed at least 7 inmates and wounded more than 50 others, often during yard altercations. Those numbers alone made Corcoran one of the deadliest prisons in America at the time. Yet as later investigations revealed, many of those shootings were not acts of necessary defense, but potentially preventable confrontations that never should have happened. The Gladiator days, blood on the yard, 1990 to 1999. By the early 1990s, Corcoran State Prison had become one of California's most feared facilities, not only among inmates, but even among correctional officers who whispered about what was happening inside. The institution was under constant lockdowns, plagued by racial tension, and home to some of the most dangerous gang members in the state. Yet what shocked the nation was not just the violence between prisoners, it was the growing suspicion that some of it was being orchestrated. The Yard program and its dark side. In theory, Corcoran's small exercise yards were meant to give high-risk inmates tightly controlled recreation. But investigators later found that these yards, sometimes no larger than a racquetball court, became the stage for what officers and prisoners alike came to call gladiator fights. Here's how it allegedly worked. Guards would place known rivals, members of the Aryan Brotherhood and Black Guerrilla family, or the Mexican Mafia and Nuestra Familia, into the same yard, despite clear warnings in the inmates' central files that they were enemies. Within minutes, predictable chaos erupted. Knives, fists, and blood. Guards stationed in the control towers, armed with rifles and shotguns, were under standing orders to shoot to stop. Every incident generated paperwork that justified the use of deadly force. But over time, the number of shootings, and the eerily consistent circumstances, drew the attention of federal investigators. Between 1989 and 1995, officers at Corcoran fired over 200 bullets during inmate altercations, killing at least 7 prisoners and wounding more than 50. Some officers claimed they were protecting lives. Others, however, said something far more disturbing was happening. Whistleblowers and the first federal probe. In 1994, a group of 7 correctional officers at Corcoran, including Officer Richard Caruso, came forward with explosive allegations. They claimed that certain supervisors and guards not only allowed fights, but encouraged them, even placing bets on which inmate would win or die. Their testimony triggered an internal investigation by the California Department of Corrections, and later, a full-scale probe by the U.S. Department of Justice. Investigators reviewed hundreds of reports, video footage, and use-of-force logs. What they found suggested systemic abuse and cover-ups. Some officers testified that prisoners who refused to fight were beaten or set up later for disciplinary action. Others alleged that yard release logs were falsified to conceal deliberate mixing of enemies. The whistleblowers paid a high price for speaking out. Many faced retaliation, demotions, harassment, or reassignment. Richard Caruso himself became a public symbol of the scandal after appearing in media interviews and testifying before grand juries. Media exposure. The public learns the truth. In 1996, the Los Angeles Times published a groundbreaking exposé titled, "Guards Accused of Setting Up Inmate Fights at Corcoran Prison." The article detailed sworn testimonies from officers and inmates, painting a grim picture of a facility where violence had become routine entertainment. Soon after, ABC's 2020 aired a televised investigation that brought the story to national attention. Former inmates described hearing guards laugh as men were shot on the yard. Families of the deceased demanded justice. The public outcry was immediate. Civil rights attorneys filed multiple lawsuits, accusing the state of allowing extrajudicial killings. The FBI and U.S. Attorney's Office in Fresno launched criminal investigations into alleged civil rights violations by prison staff. The 1998 federal trial. After years of mounting pressure, 8 correctional officers were eventually indicted on federal charges in 1998. The government accused them of violating inmates' civil rights by staging fights and using excessive force. The trial was one of the most closely watched prison cases in California history. But despite disturbing testimony, the case ended in acquittal for all defendants in 2000. Jurors cited insufficient evidence and conflicting witness accounts. Some witnesses were themselves convicted felons, and prosecutors struggled to prove coordination beyond reasonable doubt. The verdict outraged civil rights groups and former inmates who felt justice had been denied. Nonetheless, the scandal permanently stained Corcoran's reputation and triggered long-overdue reforms within the California Department of Corrections. A legacy of violence. By the end of the 1990s, Corcoran was known nationwide not for its security, but for its brutality. Oversight committees forced the CDCR to review use-of-force policies and retrain officers. The FBI recommended major procedural changes, including improved documentation of inmate compatibility before yard releases. Still, many inside the system believed the deeper issue, a culture of aggression and impunity, remained unresolved. As one former guard told the Sacramento Bee years later, Corcoran didn't create violent men. It contained them. But the system we built there made sure violence never stopped. Control, corruption, and the rise of Pelican Bay's shadow, 1999 to 2005. By the dawn of the new millennium, Corcoran State Prison stood as a cautionary tale within California's correctional system, a facility where control had come to mean containment through fear. Though the high-profile Gladiator fight trials had ended in acquittals, the damage to the prison's reputation was irreversible. Corcoran had become a national symbol of brutality and mismanagement, and the California Department of Corrections, CDC, renamed CDCR in 2005, faced mounting pressure to reform. But while federal scrutiny and media coverage brought temporary restraint, deeper structural issues, overcrowding, understaffing, and corruption, ensured that the cycle of violence continued behind the walls, a system under strain. At the turn of the century, California's prison population exceeded 160,000 inmates, far beyond the system's designed capacity. Corcoran, originally built for around 5,000, held close to 7,500 prisoners at various points. Double and even triple bunking became common practice. Segregated housing units, known as SHUs, were overflowing. The result was a volatile mix. Rival gang members forced into proximity, exhausted staff, and limited resources for rehabilitation or oversight. Administrators described it as a pressure cooker. Guards worked long shifts, often with little supervision. The stress of constant danger and administrative neglect created fertile ground for misconduct and for silence. Pelican Bay's influence and the expansion of isolation. While Corcoran drew public scrutiny, another facility, Pelican Bay State Prison, had become California's flagship for extreme isolation. Located near the Oregon border, Pelican Bay's Security Housing Unit, SHU, housed the state's most influential gang leaders in near-total isolation. After the Corcoran scandals, CDCR began modeling its control policies around Pelican Bay's design, emphasizing segregation over rehabilitation. Inmates suspected of gang affiliation were placed in indefinite isolation, sometimes for decades, based on confidential informant statements or possession of gang-related artwork or literature. At Corcoran, similar control units expanded. By 2001, hundreds of inmates were held in administrative segregation, locked in small concrete cells for 23 hours a day, with minimal human contact. Officials argued these measures were necessary to curb violence. Critics, including Amnesty International and the American Civil Liberties Union, called it psychological torture. Inmates described extreme sensory deprivation, constant fluorescent lighting, lack of outdoor exercise, and minimal communication with family. Several filed lawsuits alleging cruel and unusual punishment in violation of the Eighth Amendment, corruption in uniform. As isolation intensified, another problem festered: corruption among staff. Investigations in the early 2000s exposed patterns of contraband smuggling, falsified reports, and officer intimidation. In 2001, an internal audit found that over 30 officers had been investigated for bringing in drugs, cell phones, or other contraband to high-risk inmates. Some were convicted, others quietly dismissed. A whistleblower guard told the Fresno Bee, "The code of silence here runs deep. If you speak out, you're finished." In 2002, a scandal erupted when an officer was caught on camera exchanging envelopes with an inmate informant during a staged sting operation. The incident reignited public debate about whether California's prisons were more influenced by gang culture or the very people sworn to contain it. The cycle of violence and mental health neglect. With the growth of isolation units came another silent epidemic: mental illness. A 2003 state report found that 1 in 4 Corcoran inmates displayed symptoms of serious psychological distress, yet access to treatment was scarce. Inmates with schizophrenia or depression were often placed in segregation instead of receiving therapy. Several suicides occurred between 2000 and 2005, prompting a class action lawsuit known as Coleman versus Schwarzenegger, which accused California of systemic neglect of mentally ill prisoners. Court-appointed monitors later visited Corcoran and described, auditions as inhumane and clinically dangerous. The prison's mental health unit, under-resourced and overwhelmed, struggled to meet even basic constitutional standards. Reform that never reached the ground. Following public outcry and ongoing lawsuits, the CDCR introduced new use-of-force regulations and accountability systems. Video documentation of cell extractions became mandatory, and a force review committee was established to evaluate every incident involving lethal or less than lethal weapons. However, many reform measures were paper-based solutions. Policies that looked effective on reports but rarely changed behavior at ground level. A 2004 California Inspector General audit concluded, despite departmental directives, evidence of cultural change at Corcoran remains minimal. Oversight is inconsistent, discipline is rare, and morale among correctional officers remains divided between fear and defiance. Even as the department rebranded itself in 2005, adding Rehabilitation to its name, few inside Corcoran felt that transformation had reached them. The same walls that had witnessed blood and scandal in the 1990s now held a quieter, slower decay, a system crumbling under its own weight. The turning point approaches. By the mid-2000s, California's entire prison system faced federal oversight for overcrowding, medical neglect, and constitutional violations. Corcoran, once the epicenter of scandal, was now a key exhibit in the argument for sweeping reform. Yet, despite court mandates and media exposure, one question remained. Could a prison built on a foundation of fear ever truly rehabilitate anyone, inmate or officer alike? Scandals, suicide, and the federal takeover, 2005-present. By 2005, Corcoran State Prison had become more than a correctional facility. It was a symbol of everything broken in California's penal system. The tough-on-Ciaro era had produced prisons overflowing with inmates, haunted by neglect and riddled with corruption. Corcoran was at the center of that storm. Federal judges began describing California's prisons as cruel and unusual under the Eighth Amendment. It was no longer just about violence. It was about neglect, medical collapse, and institutional decay. The medical crisis and the federal receiver. The first major intervention came not from politicians, but from the courts. In 2005, following the Plata versus Schwarzenegger case, a federal court declared California's prison medical care system so deficient that it violated inmates' constitutional rights. Corcoran, along with San Quentin and Pelican Bay, was specifically cited for catastrophic healthcare failures. Inmates died from treatable conditions, untreated infections, missed medication, undiagnosed heart disease. One report described a man left unattended for hours after collapsing in his cell. Another documented amputations caused by untreated diabetes. That same year, a federal receiver was appointed to take control of California's prison healthcare system. It was an unprecedented move, the federal government effectively seizing operational control from the state. For Corcoran, it meant the arrival of medical oversight teams, new clinics, and mandatory healthcare audits. But change was slow. By 2007, inspectors found that the prison still suffered from chronic understaffing, outdated facilities, and a backlog of medical requests, thousands deep. The human cost, suicide, and mental health failures. As reforms struggled to take root, Corcoran faced another tragedy, a surge in suicides. Between 2006 and 2013, the facility recorded one of the highest suicide rates in the state's prison system. Inmates with documented mental illnesses were still being held in solitary confinement, sometimes for years. The suicide of inmate Gabriel Hinojosa in 2013 drew public attention after internal emails revealed that staff had ignored multiple warnings about his deteriorating condition. The federal court overseeing Coleman v. Brown, a continuation of the mental health lawsuit, cited Corcoran as a repeated violator of constitutional standards. Monitors described seeing men screaming into vents, smearing blood on cell walls, or rocking back and forth for hours in total silence. In a 2014 report, the Monitor wrote, Corcoran remains a facility where isolation is mistaken for order, and suffering is mistaken for discipline. Reform, oversight, and the era of transparency. Facing continued federal pressure, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, implemented a wave of reforms. By 2016, new leadership introduced body cameras, expanded mental health units, and greater access to educational programs. Whistleblower protections were strengthened, and the old code of silence culture began to erode, slowly. The Office of the Inspector General, OIG, gained greater independence, publishing annual reviews of use of force incidents and staff misconduct. Corcoran also saw physical changes. In 2019, portions of its security housing units were repurposed into enhanced outpatient programs, EOP, focusing on inmates with severe mental illnesses. Outdoor yards were expanded, and the use of indefinite solitary confinement was sharply reduced following statewide settlements in the Ashker versus Governor of California case. Still, for many who had lived through its darkest years, the changes came too late. Corcoran. Today, between shadows and reform. As of the 2020s, Corcoran remains a maximum security prison housing around 3,000 inmates, including those serving life sentences under California's three strikes law. It also houses part of the state's sensitive needs population, inmates separated for protection from general population prisoners. Violence still occurs, but not at the levels seen in the 1990s, transpar. ANSI has improved, with journalists and watchdogs gaining limited access for inspection and reporting. Programs for rehabilitation and vocational training now operate alongside security units, yet the legacy of Corcoran's past lingers like a shadow. For the families of those who died in its yards, and for the officers who blew the whistle decades ago, it remains a place forever tied to the consequences of unchecked power and institutional neglect. As one former inmate told The Guardian in 2021, "You can paint the walls, add therapy, or bring in cameras. But you can't erase the ghosts that built this place." Corcoran's story is not just about one prison. It's about an entire system that once believed control equaled safety. What history revealed instead was that unchecked authority breeds chaos, and silence protects no one. From the Gladiator yards of the 1990s to the mental health reforms of today, Corcoran stands as both a warning and a reminder. The line between justice and abuse can disappear behind walls no one is allowed to see. What happened inside Corcoran wasn't fiction. It was a chapter of American history written in blood, silence, and reform. From chaos to oversight, its story reminds us how fragile justice becomes when accountability is locked away. If you found this documentary powerful, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, because we're just getting started uncovering the untold stories behind America's most notorious prisons.